the most important lesson is that you have to be ready where you are to defend yourself. The settlements that were ready on October 7th were hit less hard than the ones that weren't ready. That's a sad thing to say, but it's true. And that's the most important lesson, I think, is that insofar as Israel's defense problems are local problems, in other words, they're problems that happen here and not there, people locally, right? If this kind of terrorist infiltration is something that you have to be ready for wherever you are right now.
Hello, and welcome to the Telos-Paul Institute podcast. I'm Gabriel Abram, director of the Israel Initiative at TPPI. And with me today is a guest I'm very pleased to have, Professor Dr. Michel Kochin of Tel Aviv University. Michael, would you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
So I'm an associate professor of political science and international relations at Tel Aviv University, where I've taught since 1995. I'm currently on sabbatical in the U.S., in D.C., with appointments at Hillsdale College in D.C. and at the Catholic University of America. And these days I work mostly on the early foreign policy of the U.S., national security and constitutional reform in the 1780s. So largely thanks to the promptings of the Telos people, I've put out some things recently on higher education policy in the U.S.
Terrific. Well, we're pleased that your team have been able to have your input on these things, and let's get right back into that. Among other things, I should maybe add, if you didn't mention, that you're a longtime resident of Jerusalem. Although I guess it's clear that you're Israeli since you are a professor at Tel Aviv University. You're a keen observer of Israeli political affairs. And this series that we're recording an episode of is something that, to me, falls under the umbrella of Israel's terrible and horrible, no good, very bad year. So maybe a counterintuitive question to begin with, as we sketch together how Israel got from last summer to October 7th to this summer. Is there anything good that's happened in this really rough year for Israel that comes to your mind? I can think of something or some things. There's lots of good things about Israel, but particularly in regards to this challenging year, as we delve into some of the challenges, have there been any bright spots?
So the one bright spot is that I see a lot more expressions of Israeli patriotism and on the part of Israeli Arabs citizens. Their Israeli citizenship seems more important to them these days than whatever religious difference or ethnic national difference sets them apart from the majority. So that's the one thing that I've really noticed that's good, and that as happens sometimes in society in wartime, a lot of people are getting married. That doesn't seem to have slowed. So that's interesting, especially if you look. Israel, of course, is distinct among not quite unique, but close to unique among developed countries in its rate of marriage and its birth rate, and both being good. And the war doesn't seem to have changed that all that much, though I haven't seen actual formal data, but anecdotally, it looks like the war hasn't changed that much. So those are two bright spots, and maybe the two only bright spots that I can think of in this past very difficult 2 years. And by the way, if you people dislike people who laugh at things that aren't really funny, then probably this isn't the interview for you to watch, because I do that a lot.
I may not be the right I may not be the right moderator for the series period, if that's the case. It is part of what has gotten us through this tough year. The old stereotypical Jewish sense of humor, as they say. Michael, those are two bright spots. Thank you for reminding me of those and sharing those with the audience. To sketch how it is that we've endured this year, and gotten from last summer to this summer, from the judicial reforms and the protests that were so massive that the country could have seemed almost ungovernable, to the day that Israel suffered a horrific, almost unimaginable terrorist attack. And then the aftermath of that, including the war, but also the reception of the war in the eyes of the world, and so on. What were, first of all, without going maybe too terribly deep into the weeds, but to make it clear, what were the proposed judicial reforms that are the first chapter in our story today?
Okay, well, to put this story very crudely, and I've been following it since the mid-90s, the Israeli Supreme Court seized more or less absolute and unaccountable power back in the 90s, and took upon themselves the ability to review every piece of legislation for constitutionality and every administrative action for reasonableness, without any clear empowering in the law. This high-handed approach kind of escalated because when the elected branches started talking about reform and about formal constitutional changes to reign in the Supreme Court threatened that it would in fact strike down constitutional changes, which in the 90s, at the time, Aaron Barak, who led this revolution, said that the one way to rein it in would be constitutional changes, formal changes in the basic laws of Israel. But now the Supreme Court has arrogated it to itself the power to strike down basic laws. It has done so. And so now it's completely out of control. But what happened was one way to put it is some elements on the right had opposed this from the beginning, and a few elements in the center and left. Netanyahu himself had never promised really to do anything about it, and never empowered the people who would do something about it. Prior to the Netanyahu government, the Bennett Lapid government actually talked about it just as much, and maybe, but of course they didn't really do anything either. And
for the listeners who may not be fully informed about Israeli politics, I know this is very simple for you, but Benjamin Netanyahu is who again, and who are these?
Benjamin Netanyahu is the current prime minister. He has been prime minister. He was prime minister from 96 to 99 when this revolution was really put in place. It started shortly before him, and then in those years it was really consolidated by Aaron Barak, the president of the court. He's been prime minister again since 2009 till now, with a interruption of a little more than a year, I think, by the Bennett Lapid government. And it's also so there was all
Bennett was also prime minister. Bennett was a prime minister for a while too.
Right. Yes, he was prime minister for almost all that government. And the proposed reforms, there was a whole package of reforms that would have pretty effectively empowered the elected branches and subordinated the Supreme Court into law, to the rule of law, and to constitutional law. The only thing that survived the protests of these and was actually legislated was a change in the ability of a pretty mild reform of the ability of the Supreme Court to strike down administrative actions as unreasonable, basically saying that they couldn't do that to the actions of ministers, who after all are responsible to the Knesset.
Wait a minute, there would be a law, it would be passed by the Knesset, it would be constitutional law, and the Supreme Court would say it's unreasonable, and they would dismiss it on that basis?
So what happened, that's the escalation, right? Previously, they'd done this to ordinary laws and said that they were unconstitutional in the light of the basic laws, which the Supreme Court has said is the Constitution of Israel. And now they've said even basic laws can be ruled unconstitutional if we feel like it. So that's where we are now. So the reform agitated a lot of people, and as you said, there were protests that basically made the country ungovernable. Netanyahu, who's not whose whole approach has been based on avoiding crisis and confrontation, probably because I think he's not. He knows himself to be a weak manager of crises, as he showed with COVID, and as he showed with the constitutional reform, as he showed with this war. So what I was trying to get at the beginning, but I guess it was too abstract, was that this is an issue on which a lot of people who are or were Netanyahu partisans were very exercised, but he himself never was. And he himself never promised, never committed to any measure of reform, any kind of curbing the court. He never thought whatever political price he had to pay for that would be worthwhile. The problem is this has not been reciprocated by the Israeli deep state or the Israeli administrative state. And they chose to engage in a pretty extensive campaign of lawfare to destroy him personally and politically, which the principal effect of this has not been to convict Netanyahu of anything. None of these cases have made tremendous progress, and some of them have run into hopeless dead ends. The principal effect was to alienate enough people from the center, from Netanyahu, that he had to build a coalition with the kind of people who wanted court reform. And so he got stuck making promises to them in order to get into power after the last election that previously he'd avoided making those promises because he managed to build a coalition with people who either were not eager for court reform or were opposed to it. It's worth noting that the empowerment of the court is not an especially left-wing project. It's a liberal project. Historically, the Liberal Party, the liberal elements were mostly on the right, and the Likud is, in fact, came into existence formally as a coalition of the Cherut Revisionist Party, which was and the Liberal Party. And even the Cherut Party traditionally has supported Constitution, supported the Constitutional Court, supported constitutional restraints on the government. So this was never this is not deep in war with the court, war with the judges is not deep in Netanyahu's DNA. It's something on which the Israeli right has been conflicted, and an independent judiciary came into existence in Israel in the 1950s, basically because the liberals wanted it as a check on Ben-Gurion. The part of the story I've never understood is why Ben-Gurion, who in some respects was very powerful in this respect, conceded an independent judiciary to the liberals when he had a pretty strong view against it. He wanted a partisan democratic socialist judiciary, the kind of thing that, say, somebody like Harold Lasky had called for in the 30s, the kind of thing that, to an extent, the British managed to actually implement when the socialists were in power. That was his model, and and then the judiciary would either fall into line with what he thought was the preferred opposition, was a liberal. Instead of having a liberal independent judiciary, Ben-Gurion would have preferred a partisan judiciary that was socialist or liberal, depending on who was in charge of the government, because that's the rivalry that he wanted to set up. He wasn't all that successful. He wasn't successful in that either. That I understand a little better. He couldn't resist the temptation to co-opt the liberals, to buy them off. So it could be you put these two pieces together, and one of the things he bought off the liberals with was an independent judiciary. But I haven't actually studied that carefully enough to know if that's the answer. But if there are any PhD students, that's a good topic. How Israel wound up with an independent judiciary in the 1950s, even though Ben-Gurion didn't want one. And I'd suggest as a research hypothesis, which if you do this for me, you're going to have to either prove or eliminate, that it was part of the package that he used to buy off the liberals and destroy them as an effective opposition force in the 50s. But anyway, we'll have to leave that for future political scientists. So
could it have been anything? Yeah. Could it have been that he firmly refused to commit to a constitution unambiguously? He said, even if you pass laws and you say they're constitutional laws, I think I'm paraphrasing accurately. He famously gave the speech. He said, Jews will never, I think he said the Jewish people, he said, in America that can work. He said it wouldn't work in the Jewish state because the people would say, why don't we pass laws now? Those were laws then. And he refused the Constitution. Could he have said, well, maybe the judiciary is kind of a little bone I can throw to the folks in that direction?
Yeah, I don't know. He was against the Constitution. To say he refused, this is one of the issues on which Ben-Gurion, it's an interesting move of founders, and he's not the only one to do it. One thing that some founders have tried to do, both Ben-Gurion and Ataturk, I'm not sure of any other examples, is they try to create the axis of opposition. So they take a stand, and in order to encourage the development of a political opposition that takes the opposite stand, because that's the opposition they want, as opposed to other possible axes of opposition, which that move is intended to exclude. So on this is part of his setting up at the beginning in 1949, the liberals as the opposition. As he says, you guys want a constitution, I'm against it, here are my reasons. So he exercised a certain amount of political power to prevent the emergence of a constitution. But he said over and over again, look, and they even, I think, had free votes sometimes where he didn't use party discipline. He just said, I'm against this, here are my reasons. If you guys want one, well, under the system, there's going to be some way for you to get the votes together, either in the Knesset, in the electorate, and maybe you'll be able to do this, even though I don't want it, and despite my reasons. But I don't want this. Here are my reasons. I'm going to do something to block this. But he also spoke so as to encourage, in a way to encourage that as part of this axis of socialist liberal opposition, which is what he wanted to encourage. And then what happened is, when it became clear that the liberals were starting to grow as an opposition, he kind of lost his courage and bought them out by giving them government jobs and changing the fiscal priorities of the government. That I know he did. But it could be that one of the things he did to buy them out was allow the growth of an independent judiciary, which he had previously, just like he took a stand against constitutionalism, he took a stand against an independent judiciary. And you have to realize judicial independence, in the old British Westminster system prior to this idiocy of the Supreme Court of the UK, they did not have an independent judiciary. Every judge was a political appointment. The head of the judiciary was a minister. The Supreme and he went out. He came in and he went out. The Lord Chancellor with the government. So they had no trouble. They did make some effort to appoint people based on professional qualifications, but it was all very strictly politically controlled, in the understanding that Parliament was sovereign, not the judges, not any written constitution, and the role of the judges was to follow the law and not to review legislation. They were supposed to enforce legislation, not review it. And so that's what Ben-Gurion said he wanted. The Israelis up till 48 had been ruled by the British. Ben-Gurion talked about what happened with FDR and the courts. And he, like a lot of democratic socialists, regarded that as undemocratic and terrible, the fight between FDR and the courts over the New Deal. And he said quite explicitly he doesn't want this in Israel. But he as part of his both digs at and encouragement to the liberals, he said, well, maybe you guys want that. And, he didn't say over my dead body, but he said, I'm against it and I'm going to try to stop you. But, if you get the votes, I suppose that's what you'll do. So it's the whole relationship. The point of that is the whole relationship between the right and the judiciary is very complicated. And basically all the right-wing politicians of the generation previous Netanyahu, people like Arendt and Meridor, were all big fans. Begin were all big fans of an independent judiciary and generally supported the constitution, the judicial revolution of Barak in the mid-90s. Begin was out of politics by then, but these other guys were either silent or supportive. Based on this historical tradition of the independent judiciary as a check to the left, to the socialist left.
So what changed, Michael? Why then were these reforms proposed from the right, from the Likud, and why, if from what you're saying they were needed, because you talk about absolute power and kind of a juristocracy, why were they proposed from a standpoint where that hadn't been the case before, and why were they so strongly resisted? And if they were indeed needed,
right? So they were proposed. I think you just have a generation of people like me, the generation my age, a little older. They look at this and they think maybe an independent judiciary is a good thing, but a judiciary that's supreme and absolute, kind of iffy. And, some of it has to do with the role of the court in managing the occupation, right? People who wanted a harsher line with the Palestinians are unhappy about the things the court does that that restrict the occupation. To some extent, people on the left, like Gabizon, who was pretty militant against the court and militant on Palestinian rights, were unhappy with the degree of license that the court granted to the occupation. And so
Ruth
I think
Gavison,
Ruth Gavison was a
great legal scholar.
right. So she was a great legal scholar. She was the principal academic enemy of the judicial revolution at the time in the 90s. Aaron Barak singled her out by name. The ideologue of this revolution, the president of the court, Barak, singled her out by name as his principal opponent. So her thinking was complicated, and I'm not sure to what extent she ever published this, but I remember this from email lists that I was on with her, where her view was that the court probably should be more active in taking the side of Palestinians against the occupying forces and restricting the occupying forces, but the undemocratic, anti-democratic, allegedly ultra-powerful court didn't have the legitimacy. That seemed to be what she thought. That a court that was above the law did not have the legitimacy to actually effectively rein in the occupation or the settlement. And so she thought what you needed was a court that was more restrained, therefore more legitimate, therefore more able to interfere with what she regarded as some of the atrocities of the occupation. So, so that was part of it was that as the country has turned right and as the right has turned more right, more people on the right were more unhappy, I think, about some of the red lights that the Supreme Court put on the occupation, on Israel's military efforts, because Aaron Barak thought everything was subject to judicial review, though he occasionally backtracked on this. But
everything was justiciable.
Everything was justiciable, including every single military action taken by the country. And as the country turned right, I think to some extent there was more, the right got, more right-wing, more hawkish, and it became unhappier with the ways that the court interfered with the occupation and the potential for the court to interfere with Israeli national security actions apart from the occupation.
Perhaps the Jewish character of the state too. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but wasn't there some fear that this very liberal, is it fair to say, Supreme Court, a kind of technocratic elite, is that a fair characterization, would water down the Jewish and democratic quality of the state and propose to view it more as the phrase goes, a state of all its citizens, which is, if you're not familiar with Israel, it might not be clear what we're talking about, but was that a concern for those who thought the court had too much power that would basically, in layman's terms, water down the Jewish character of Israel?
Yeah, I suppose. It's a little complicated because what the court wound up doing was establishing a certain mostly secular, really, they came pretty close to enshrining Reform Judaism as the official religion, which would have been kind of strange given how few actual Reform Jews there are in this country. So,
Weird. It's weird.
Yeah, you have to realize in fact, secularization doesn't have much constituency in Israel because, as I pointed out a long time ago, secularization would mean probably giving up control of Judaism and allowing everybody to interpret it freely, which would give free rein to a lot of people whose views you and I might regard as nasty, racist, unpleasant, and violent. And therefore, it's been the official character of the rabbinate, the official character of Judaism in the state is a force the state uses to govern religion.
More than the other way around. People think that Israel is a kind of a theocracy, but it's quite the contrary.
Well, it's a kind of theocracy, and like the kind of theocracy that 18th century England was, right? This is, also true in 18th century England. It was remarked at the time in 18th century England that they had they didn't want the Church of England to be too extreme religiously in a whole variety of directions, in which there were people who actively tried to pull it. And they used the official governance of the church, the subordination of the church to the state, the theocratic aspect of England, right, which is theocratic, officially, nominally at least theocratic to this day. They used that to govern the church and to try to govern Christianity in England, to disempower the people they regarded as extremists, as zealots, as fanatics. And it works that way in Israel too. Herzl already if you read Herzl, you can see the lineaments of how to do this in Herzl's writings at the time. So it's been a big part of
a great leader, founder, more or less, of modern Zionism.
Modern Zionism, right? So you read Alton Neuland, you read the Jewish State. He more or less explains, especially in Alton Neuland, he explains pretty much how that works in a few vignettes. And so, that leads to a lot of screaming and yelling. The state of all its citizens, I think, led to less screaming and yelling, I think, than immigration, where the court, like a lot of these Supreme Courts, but here with less legitimacy, had prevented the government from taking some steps to curb illegal immigration. That I think might have been a more acute issue. Certainly, it bothered me a lot more as somebody who, that thought somebody who thought, in fact, the state wasn't being secularized and shouldn't be secularized. For the reasons I just gave, the immigration thing did bother me a great deal. And we've seen in other countries the same judicial overreach on immigration, most notably in Britain, to some extent in the U.S.
So what filled these streets, Michael? I'm sitting here with my back to Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv, as it so happens. The famous Kaplan Street protests arose by the millions of people who abhorred the idea of judicial reform and who put up banners over here and over there and everywhere saying it's the end of democracy. Right. They were defending democracy, and these changes would mean the end of democracy in Israel. It would be fascism in Israel. Right. Bibi was a monster. The way you describe it, it doesn't sound so bad. It sounds like it was maybe even potentially a positive, needed set of reforms. But what filled these streets with what kind of people? Why?
These people correctly saw the judges as their people, and they saw any check on the power as a check on the power of their people. Basically, you had a clique of a racial, ethnic clique of Ashkenazi Jews and some, if we use the parlance, kind of harsh parlance, a few non-Ashkenazi Uncle Toms. And the truth in their protest was that this really would have threatened to check their power to some extent. And they didn't want to give up that power. And in the end, they demonstrated that they had enough power to actually make the country ungovernable if the reforms went ahead. The language of democracy here, as we often see with opposition to populist or nationalist parties, is the opposite of the truth, right? It's the same kind of thing that where you see Viktor Orban, who wins in free elections with overwhelming majorities and holds no political prisoners and has no official government censorship of anything, is described as an autocrat, okay? Whereas countries like Germany or Poland under the new government, or the United States or Canada, which repress protests, which throw peaceful protesters in jail, which censor expression, which use lawfare against their political opponents, and hold, in the case of Joe Biden's America, thousands of political prisoners. They're quote unquote defending democracy. So there's basically an international campaign of lying, to some extent financed by certain international organizations and persons you can point to. But it's one of the distinctive features of anti-populist, anti-democratic rhetoric in our time, that it uses the language of defending democracy to defend unchecked administrative rule, to defend to oppose any kind of democratic reform where people propose democratic reform. So in that respect, Israel's not unique. The empowerment of the judiciary as a bulwark against democracy, that was pretty unique, though we've seen such developments in Britain, for example, and the particular racial ethnic class thing that powered these protests, the racial ethnic class resentment by the people who regarded themselves, as Leo Strauss used to say, they are rightly regarded as the natural aristocracy of the country. So what you had was basically a protest of would-be aristocrats, of aristocratic hirelings and camp followers, against democracy, but without the intellectual honesty to say we support aristocratic rule, unchecked judge rule keeps us in power, therefore we want unchecked judge rule. That would have been, as a political scientist, I would have been against it, but at least it would have been forthright and honest and acceptable. But instead, we got this really toxic rhetoric of toxic and dishonest rhetoric of defending democracy that we see elsewhere deployed against democratic forces. And for that, I think the explanation is not really Israeli. It has to do with the way these forces coordinate and work together and spread messages and imitate each other across the world.
So we're talking about the Israeli PMC, or professional managerial class. Is that fair to say? The deep shtetl, so to speak. People in high tech, academia, the media. Predominantly Ashkenazi, as you say, well-off people, by the way, who dedicate themselves to service in the army as well, which I want to ask you about in a minute, because I think that was part of the ungovernability question leading up to the question of October 7. But before that, I'd like to push back a little and ask you, what do you say to those, hearing what you just said a moment ago, who respond by saying we're defending liberal democracy? It may not be the kind of populist democracy that you're speaking of, Michael, but we don't want just plain democracy. We've been pretty clear about that. We want liberal democracy. Maybe we should have said we're defending liberalism. We think that there would be too much power, unchecked power, just the sheer majority of votes in the Knesset, and that's if not anti-democratic, it's anti-liberal and anti-liberal democracy. There'll be too much power in the Knesset. We don't have a constitution. In America, there's checks and balances. Israel doesn't have them, and that's what the judiciary is for. So, aren't you empowering a kind of sovereign Knesset, or a King Malach Habibi? Habibi al-Melech.
Well,
Habibi al-Melech.
Right. So here, look, there are a couple things to say. One is, if you believe in the rule of law has to apply to the judges too, and maybe more so to the judges. Okay. So what we're not talking about freeing the Knesset from constitutional restraint so much as putting the judges under constitutional restraint. And so it's a little hard to see why, from a liberal point of view, you would be against that. Okay, you might say, in addition, we have to put the Knesset under constitutional restraints. But you'd think, from a liberal point of view, it'd be even more important to have judges who were subordinate to the law than it would be to have a Knesset that was subordinate to some sort of constitution or constitutional norms. So that's part of the dishonesty here. Another part of the dishonesty is that the judges, in fact, are not all that liberal, and especially when their prerogatives are challenged. And the opponents of reform propose things like putting people in jail for proposing the reforms, including people I knew personally, putting people in jail for proposing the reforms. So the idea that they were defending liberalism is just part of the lie, as far as I can tell.
What was the identity politics aspect? I heard a lot that gay rights, women's rights, in Tel Aviv being the most liberal city in Israel, there was this sort of new social movements, we used to call it in America, aspect to it, where opposing judicial reforms was defending gay rights, women's rights. Is that a red herring, or?
I'm not sure it's really a red. That goes back to another thing which we've also seen in other countries, right? Which is a lot of this revolution in supposed gay rights. Was it judicially imposed and was forced upon democratic majorities that were not eager for these changes or even had opposed them, right? So in the U.S., for example, in liberal California, a referendum banning gay marriage passed and was struck down by the courts. And if you ask on what basis, it's reasoning that's actually fairly hard to understand in my view, from a legal point of view. But yeah, no.
The founding fathers in America apparently anticipated this, but we won't go off on that tangent. Yeah.
Right. So I think there are people there were winners and losers from Israel's judicial revolution, from the empowerment of, and people who think that their rights are secured by judges and not by law got something. Okay, but as we saw in the U.S., right, abortion rights at the federal level were secured by judges and not by law, and not really by legal reasoning, because the legal reasoning was really hard to understand and impossible to defend legally. And eventually, after a campaign of decades, the people who were opposed, the men and women who were opposed to abortion, got a majority of judges, and they ended federal abortion rights. So if you want to secure rights, it seems to me the way to secure rights is through law. And the way to secure law is through legislation or through constitutional legislation, and not to take any judicial shortcuts. And in a way, these people are right. They got things that were very important to them by judicial imposition. And they will lose them the same way. That's what they need to understand, is they will lose them the same way if the judiciary isn't reformed. What you have to imagine, when you're a defender of unchecked power, you have to, if you want to be intellectually honest, you have to imagine that power in the hands of your enemies. So that's what I would ask the gay rights advocates. Imagine the same power by which the judges gave you these rights in the hands of the people who want to take them away. So maybe this isn't the kind of politics you want to do, just like it turned out that the judicialized politics of abortion boomeranged eventually on the pro-abortion people. But I can't deny that that there were winners and losers from this, and not just the judges.
Among the protesters, the PMC, if I can call it that, or the sorts of folks that you described very ably, who saw it as in their interest to stage these week after week, every Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat after Shabbat, the streets in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa would fill with millions of protesters in a small country, right? Week after week after week, for months after months after months. And then, speaking of ungovernability, it seems to me there was a kind of a key moment, one of a few, but the thing that I noticed that Israelis, some Israelis have trouble forgiving at this time after October 7 is there was a point where it got to the point where pilots were threatening to refuse to show up to do reserve duty. It's not just reserve duty; it's an integral part of the functioning of the Israeli military. And was that a problem in terms of our readiness? I think. Was it Benny Gantz or was it Yoav Gallant instead? Out loud, our readiness is being threatened. We got to do something about this one way or the other. Hamas speaks English; they speak Hebrew even, and weren't we broadcasting the world one way or another that our military was having enough to do to sort of keeping itself together? We're not Switzerland; we're in a tough neighborhood. I don't think anyone's suggesting Hamas said, okay, now's our chance. But could we have looked more vulnerable and been more vulnerable than we needed to be? As I understand it, there was some impact, some reduction of readiness. Is it serendipity that we went from being so divided over judicial reforms to being united on October 7th, then 8th, and after, by virtue of suffering the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust? I don't have to mention the details of that. People are familiar with it. People make connections between these two sort of events, is the reason I'm asking you. And they do it in very different ways. There are people who say it's all Bibi's fault. He caused the one and it led to the other, and he was bad about the other. And there are people who see it just the other way around. What's your view?
I mean, it's true that Bibi lost control of the army and the security forces in the spring of 23, and that forced him to back off most of the reforms. They did in fact show that the country was ungovernable, that it was, the rot was clearly greater in the police and the security forces than in the army. But, the people who you count on to be the state withdrew their support from Netanyahu if he persisted in the reforms. and forced him to back down on most of them. And this obviously showed cracks in the society, in the state. And I think that one can find the quotes from captured Hamas people, et cetera, where they talk about this and that they saw vulnerability as a result of that. On the other hand, it's my understanding, I haven't looked into this carefully. It's my understanding that Hamas was planning to do this in Passover of 23 and stood down because the Israelis got wind of it and stood up. And so, and that was pretty close to the peak of the yelling and screaming. So I think it was a factor, but I think, the thing is, we would have to, this belongs to the war subject, but Israel was surprised. In order to avoid being surprised, they would have had to surprise the surprise. They failed to do that. That's basically, from my point of view, that's the security story of October 7th. And that's, it's not clear to me that the failure to surprise the surprise on October 7th has much to do directly with the protests or with the splits in society or the state. But in any event, you're eventually going to fail to surprise the surprise. So even if those were factors on October 7th, there would have been, had they weren't factors in my understanding in April. In other words, in April, Israel was able to perceive the threat and get ready, and therefore, and unfortunately, their readiness was revealed to Hamas, and Hamas stood down. But eventually, you are going to get surprised, right? That surprises happen shouldn't be a surprise. Is something that I say often about this. And the reasons why Israel was surprised on October 7th, I think maybe they should concern us. But what should concern us more, I think, is our failure to mitigate the consequences of being surprised. That's what we have to think about going forward, is knowing that people want to kill us, knowing that occasionally they will surprise us, knowing occasionally they will surprise us to a degree that surprises us. We need to figure out how we're going to mitigate the consequences of whatever happens to the extent that we can. And there, I think there's some things, I've discussed this a little bit with the Eviatar Matanya, the former general teaches in our department, but there are some things I think that we can do. If these were the events that led to the particular surprise, that's like interesting, but it's accidental really, because if it hadn't been this, there would have been something else, because there's always something else, and if it hadn't happened then, it would have happened later. And
so it's wrong on this basis alone, but you correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like it's wrong to say, for various reasons, as many do, it's Bibi. And it's wrong to say it was the army and the soldiers threatening not to quite defend us thoroughly enough, or some of the leadership in the army. Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff, is accused sometimes still of having built the wrong army, and even.
All of that might be highly relevant. All of that might be highly relevant, right?
It might be relevant.
Lieberman, so after all, the army doesn't decide what kind of army we have, the government does. And Bibi's been leading the government for an awfully long time, except for a short period. The whole defense posture of the country is in the end set by the government and the Knesset. And most of the time for the last 15 years, Bibi's been in charge. Second, you'd have to go back and see what Bibi's policy toward Gaza was, why Lieberman quit over it. There were people who thought that the particular policies Bibi were adopting made us too vulnerable, and that was before all this. Lieberman warned of it. Right. So the way I would frame that is there were people who thought that what we were actually doing and not doing made us too vulnerable to surprise, and a lot of that, formally, that responsibility, the lion's share of it has to go to the people who are actually in power, and therefore the lion's share of it probably winds up on Netanyahu's. It's Netanyahu's fault. But the reasons why it was his fault, I don't think have much to do with the court reform or any of that. And to my mind, the reasons aren't really that interesting. What we need is a plan for the current situation and the situation into the foreseeable future. Somebody needs to propose such a plan, and then they have to go to the country and get the confidence required to do that. And sadly, I haven't seen that happen. As far as I can tell, that hasn't happened yet. Nobody really, even if it's to a large extent, I would say it is Netanyahu's fault. But in order to move on from Netanyahu, we need somebody who is going to tell us how they're going to do things so that we can approve that and they can get on doing them. And I don't really see that happening. It was pretty humiliating for Gantz to quit because he thought the government's plans were inadequate. You're a minister. You were you were chief of the general staff. If you think the plans are no good, so where's your plan, Benny? Where's your plan? No plan from you either. Well, okay. I've said ever since this guy got into politics, I've said he was unfit.
Who's Benny Gantz and why did he threaten to quit?
He quit, I think, in the end. He quit because
in the end he quit. Yeah,
he quit.
No, that's right.
So he's an opposition politician. He joined in a unity government, I think, without portfolio. After October 7th, he'd been chief of the general staff. He'd been, I think, he's had he's been in politics a certain amount of time. He's had a certain number of political jobs. I think defense minister, very briefly speaker of the Knesset, and it's but it's the responsibility of people like that who have experience, who have a following, to articulate the plans to deal with an emergency.
Right.
And instead he's complaining the other guys aren't articulating plans, which, as an academic critic who never served in the army, maybe I have a right to do that, but he doesn't. Somebody else has to.
It's your job.
So that's what we're missing is not just criticism, which is fair and warranted, and perhaps more than warranted, but what we're missing are the alternatives. And that's the vacuum that has to be filled if we're going to move on.
And when we're about to move on to the American campus, before we do, at the risk of driving maybe our audience crazy with details if they're not so hung up on every detail of Israeli politics as you and I are. There was one other critic in this scenario, Yoav Gallant. Would you comment on? You spoke about Benny Gantz a bit. I mentioned Herzl Levy. Some people think he should resign. He's the chief of staff when this happened, but we sort of already touched on that. Yoav Gallant is another one of these figures who's critical, and he's in government. And does he have alternatives to offer? Do you have a view of him?
I haven't followed him as closely, so I let's move on. I don't really have anything so informed to say.
I didn't invite you here to go through down the list of every Knesset member. Michael, speaking of surprises, it was surprising to some people, certainly, that on October 7th on the American College campus, people were celebrating October 7th. Even before Israel had responded really to this vicious attack, the campuses were starting to fill up with protesters celebrating Hamas, defending Hamas, shouting that Israel's committing genocide before Israel had really responded. And in due course, we had something that some people call the Tentifada, the Intifada of the tents, that was, everybody knows about. The American campus showed itself to be riddled with support for a far right-wing fascist Islamic terrorist organization. That was surprising. What's your view of how that comes about and what it means?
I mean, you have a lot of post-colonial ideologues, and they populate and have taken over, various parts of the university to varying extents. I think it's a complex problem with decades of history, and as people who are addictive viewers of Telos videos knows, I have a very simple solution to this, which I intend to apply to the extent that I'm empowered, which is simply to remind everybody who runs an American university that they are settler colonial universities in a settler colonial state and obliged in return for their very expensive privileges like accreditation and immunities from taxation, they're obliged to advance the cause of America, which is a settler colonial state. So, I think that we could talk for a long time about how this happened, and I think you have in various fora. Whereas my response is, I'm not that interested in how it happened. I'm interested in enforcing a certain response, which I think will be effective, and which I'm going to push for until it's, I'm going to push for until it's used. And once it's used, we can assess in an after action report to what extent it was effective. But that's my analysis in a nutshell. That's what I want to do. And the root causes of this are not so interesting to me because I think the commanding heights of higher education policy are in the hands of the settler colonial American state, and they just need to be used the way that, and then things will change very radically. The British, once Washington got his cannons up to Dorchester Heights, the British left Boston. They didn't wait to see what would happen. And once it becomes clear that universities' privileges depend on their falling into line with the mainstream of American opinion on fairly basic questions, not Israel so much as, basically settler colonialism. Right? All these flagship state universities are named literally after settler colonial states. Like, come on, people. All these private universities, Stanford University. What's Stanford University? It's a railroad zillionaire who founded Stanford University. Vanderbilt, another railroad zillionaire. Just stop, people. Just stop. And you're going to stop. Why? Because the canons of higher education policy at the federal and state level are trained on you and will be fired if you don't, fall into line. And so I want to try that. And we don't need to study, just like Washington didn't need to study the root causes of the British occupation of Boston. You just need to get the cannons up to the top of Dorchester Heights, which was not easy. We don't really need to study, I think, how the campus got that way. We need to apply Kochin's fairly simple formula for making them stop being that way in certain important respects, and things will get a lot better. You
have some practical ideas.
I have only a practical response. I'm going to leave the theory to, like Washington. I'm going to leave the theory and the history to other people. I have a practical response, which I think will work, and which I'm trying to sell politically, and I hope it's what we manage to do.
And you're in DC now, working.
I'm in DC. I'm telling everybody this. I'm writing it in various fora available to me, and it represents that kind of attitude towards higher education to some extent represents a radical departure from the usual conservative response, which is to try to defend individual and academic freedom and defend institutional autonomy. Whereas I'm saying no, we have to subordinate institutional autonomy to state purposes. That's something American conservatives have been reluctant to do, mostly with regard to higher education. So I have to get my people in line. I have to get their spears all pointing the right way, and then we're waiting for the signal, November 5th, and maybe we'll be empowered to do this, and maybe we won't. But if we're empowered, I intend to do my whatever I can think of to make sure this charge goes through, and if necessary, lead it, and if possible.
We're speaking on Sunday, July 14th. It was late Saturday, or it was early Sunday, July 14th, where I was. What time was it? It was July 13th when Donald Trump narrowly escaped assassination. And since you talk about it, regime change, so to speak, or a new administration coming in with some fresh ideas about higher education. Any guesses? People are speculating. The pundits are punditizing. what do you make of this heroic photograph with his fist in the air, and more importantly, the event itself, for the prospects of the country and perhaps for your own work?
Right. So, I mean, what we saw was a lot of heated up rhetoric, in a way the same as the rhetoric of the anti-judicial reform protests, about how Trump was a danger to democracy, New Republic, Trump is Hitler cover right before this. So there's been a lot of incitement. Okay, there's been a lot of incitement that intellectually is very hard to take seriously, but politically has been fairly effective. And so, the Washington Post, I don't know if I'll send you later a photo of the editorial page of the Washington Post, but they had a very short editorial with a lot of blank space surrounding it, emphasizing that this is all they want to say. But their "Democracy Dies in Darkness" banner that they've been running since the beginning of the Trump administration, they haven't taken down. So they haven't completely thought through how their rhetoric helped to get us here. And we'll have to see where that goes.
They will say that Trump's rhetoric, I think you make a persuasive point. I think J.D. Vance made a very strong tweet to this effect that people can find on Twitter if they haven't already. There are those who are already saying, au contraire, Donald Trump used to talk at his rallies about roughing people up. January 6th is his responsibility. And he has sort of reaped what he sows. I can hardly, it's such an obscene kind of blaming the victim, particularly at the moment when he's just narrowly escaped a bullet in the head. But that is the other line, the other side. What do you say to that? That Trump upped the violence in the country himself. He incited. And the right wing that surrounds him is the source of incitement. That's
look, to some extent, I guess you can blame, but there is a certain amount of justified both sidesism, because there's a serious political problem, which is, to govern you have to control the street, and to win as the opposition you have to show that if they don't let you play by the rules, they can't control the street. So that's a big part of it here. Is elections are an alternative to violence. That's Malcolm X, the ballot or the bullet. And the way that we ensure we get to use ballots is by showing that we are ready to use bullets, which means both, being prepared mentally, psychologically, rhetorically. Okay. So I think, one shouldn't be too goody two-shoes about this. You mentioned Switzerland earlier. There's an old Swiss custom which is still practiced to some extent, which is that to vote, you have to show up with your gun or your sword, in your canton. You have to show that you're taking this very seriously and you understand what it's about. And so, it's not all pleasant and pretty and all that, but one also shouldn't exaggerate.
We are Switzerland, then, because everybody's carrying a gun.
Right.
The soldiers are everywhere.
Right. Yeah. So Israel, unfortunately, that's, when we get to the lessons of the war, one of the lessons is in Israel, there's no right to bear arms. Private gun ownership is substantially restricted. It's still restricted despite some reforms that were put in after October 7th. This is probably all a big mistake and needs to be changed. But I would say look, it is the ballot or the bullet. And if you want to keep your ballots, people have to be reminded of that from time to time. The ways they're reminded of that are not always pleasant or especially attractive, but because, like an electrician working on the wires, you have to know what the dangers are, and have to deal with them the right way. And it doesn't help to have fantasies, okay? To think that the things that aren't dangerous are dangerous, or vice versa, is not helpful. Doesn't really help us deal with this. That would be my response. So if you want to blame Trump for some things he said, I mean, like, I'm not the guy who wants to put people in jail for saying stuff. So go ahead and blame him and we can argue it out. And, probably some of the time, some of the things you'll say against him will be right. But you have to keep in mind, you have to be aware of this problem, right? For example, when Trump had to, was in the California primary in 2016, he had to be brought in to a rally via a side entrance because he was being chased by gangs linked to Mexican cartels. So, like, the idea that that like things were okay if it hadn't been from a few words from Trump is just wrong, right? The problem is the problems are much more serious than that, and the dangers are much more serious. And that means that people have to face them seriously, which means not with exaggerated rhetoric, right? When Trump stood up with his fist, right, and yelled, fight, 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 I think he did two things. One is he probably saved a lot of lives, because I think if there had been hours of uncertainty about Trump's health, things might have gotten out of control. And he had the calmness of mind, the calmness of decision to see that right away, that he had to show himself as in relatively good shape to the crowd, despite the wound and despite the blood on his face. And second, right, he raised the fist. He said, fight, fight, fight. He did not say, we're going to be nice and peaceful. He said, it's his version of Malcolm X, the ballad of the bullet. One way or another, there's going to be a fight. Better it be a fight in using laws, using the ballot box. But if not, it's the fist, and it's the angry rhetoric that is intended to make people angry and use their force in defense of their rights. And that's not, none of this. You have to face this soberly and sensibly, and that's, I think, what everybody should take from this moment is, yes, we are very close to the edge in America. We don't want to go there. And we will go there if people don't understand what's going on and understand how to deal with it. And that would be my, and that applies to everybody. It applies to me, and it applies to all my fellow Trump partisans and Mr. Trump, and it applies to our political rivals.
I don't have a catalog in my head of attempted failed assassinations of political figures, but I sort of have the image in mind, maybe you know more than me, of when this happens, and if the person is fortunate enough to survive, don't they typically sort of cover up, so to speak, stay down, huddle close to the ground, and just safely get out there? I never saw somebody force himself up out of the security people, the security detail, and put his fist in the air. That I can recall in the history of assassination attempts. Gerald Ford had one, Reagan had one. Am I wrong in assuming that isn't the thing? It's just to like reduce his exposure and get him out of there. But this guy Trump, instinctively, no one can plan for this. This just he had a bullet. This hit his in the ear, and he's sort of struggling with the security to get up and that's who he is.
So famously, Teddy Roosevelt, campaigning in 1912, was shot in Milwaukee and went on with his speech. But we don't have the video. Unfortunately, the internet wasn't in existence in 1912, and I'm not sure there's even any film of it. The film techniques then were pretty primitive, so it would have been tough. And so
well, I stand corrected in that respect.
But Trump, I think, perhaps wisely, Trump did not try to go on with the rally. I would, knowing him, he probably, once they got him into the car, he probably did ask them, do we really have to leave? And they said, yes, Mr. Trump, we really have to leave.
No, they don't give him a choice. They don't give him a choice.
Part of it was, unlike with Roosevelt, somebody was actually killed, somebody else was wounded. It was not a situation where, it's like the Queen's, you can't, if you're a protectee, you can't stay around there simply because you're too much of a distraction from the emergency response. Sadly, that the full TR playbook wasn't available just for that reason. Yeah. So no, he's, as I've said to you privately, he's a real master of video. He understands how things look quickly and intuitively based on years of experience, and so he knew what he had to show. And it was brave, and and I think he may be, if assuming the situation is saved, we'll go back and look at that as one of the things that helped to save the situation. I think was that he showed himself to the crowd as bloody but unbowed. Is the cliche, and in this case, it's literally true.
Would one be forgiven for feeling that this attack on Trump maybe I'll say it before he does, was attack on all of us?
Well, it's an attack on the democratic system. It is. It symbolically, right? The guy intended to blow Trump's head off at a Trump rally in front of a global television audience. Um, you know, I I guess I mean, maybe it's a personal weakness or something, but I'm not viscerally opposed to political violence. I taught a whole course on party conflict, where one of the questions I wanted to thrash out with the students was why and when exactly are we against political violence, and why is this does this distinction deserve the kind of bright line that people seem to think it does? So I'm not so clear on this. I don't. I think that one of the ways you have civil discourse between extremists and the mainstream is because everybody has a lot of guns, and the fact that uh, the U.S. for example, there's a fairly I know that I went to the Tacoma Park Independence Parade, and two ahead of us in the parade. I went with the Masons. Two ahead of us in the parade was the VFW, and the VFW. If you actually meet these guys, and I've met them off and on. Uh, a lot of them are really lefties, and especially in the lefty bastion like Tacoma Park, Maryland. A lot of them are basically communists, the veterans of foreign wars, these guys who were in the army. So, and the fact is, the American army doesn't try to keep people out, at least at the enlisted level, for having extreme left-wing views, and they don't try very hard to keep people out with extreme right-wing views. So whoever you are in America, you can get military training, you can own a gun, you can go to meetings, you can march in parades, you can blare your Stalinist music in the 4th of July parade, which was what the VFW was doing, right? Woody Guthrie, that old Stalinist. And, it's, I don't know how many people heard it and coded it as Stalinist and said, this is the VFW being the VFW, or at least the Tacoma Park VFW being the Tacoma Park VFW. But I was not surprised by any of this. And I think on the whole, it's a good thing that the commies have guns, just like it's a good thing that the Republicans have guns, and the Democrats have guns, and the civil rights leaders have guns, and everybody has guns. And when everybody has guns, like at these Swiss cantonal meetings, when everybody comes with their gun, then we're ready to talk. Then we'll talk about our problems in a calm, cool, and collected way, because we know if we don't, it's going to be bad for everybody. And that's what we need to remind ourselves of this. The alternatives, it's the ballot or the bullet, and we should choose the ballot because the alternative to the bullet is going to be bad for everybody. It's going to be bad for the winners, and it's going to be bad for the losers. And so let's stick to the ballot. That's what Malcolm X was saying. We're ready to go either way, and it's everybody's readiness to go either way that keeps it from going either way. Right now, part of the problem with the feminization of political discourse is that all of this kind of talk and all of this kind of action is mostly a male thing, right? The VFW guys are a bunch of commies. I don't know how many women are active in the VFW. There aren't very many women in the American Legion. I was told by a former state commander of the American Legion. I doubt there are very many women in the VFW, and so there are, violence is a male thing, and thinking about violence is a male thing, and part of the difficulty of the feminization of our politics and the feminization of the professional managerial class is we all have a much more hysterical attitude toward political violence. Hysterical, of course, comes from the Greek for uterus, right? So our ability to think calmly and coolly about terrible things has not is weaker than it used to be. And that doesn't make the terrible things any less terrible or the prospect of them any less likely. It just makes our ability to manage them coolly and calmly. It just weakens our ability to manage them coolly and calmly. And so that's something that we need to think about, how we can, how we can think about these things more sensibly and less hysterically.
Well, we're almost out of time. We're going to need to start to wrap up. As we do so, one more thing on this. Who's been more violent, the left or the right, the Democrats or the Republicans in the U.S. of late? I'm thinking of what do we call them, George Floyd riots on the one hand, 6 on the other. Is it possible to say, because you're making an interesting sort of observation or proposal about a kind of equilibrium of forces.
That
Um, the cities were practically burnt down with the approval of the U.S. government not long ago uh, by the left, I guess we call those folks. Seems to me, but you're the expert on this stuff, that right wing, let's say, violence and violent protest, to the extent it exists, it seems to me it's not so well regarded, and there's not as much of it. But is that incorrect?
well, the professional managerial class and the state in general across the world is very well armed and guarded against right wing violence. Right, they're not so good toward left wing violence, at least in the last few years. But I don't. I think this question of who's to blame and who was yelling more. That I think I would say that's kind of a hysterical response. That the real problem is that the people who talked about shooting Trump were not sufficiently afraid of what Trump's supporters would do if that actually happened. Okay, the balance of fear has been lost. So I wouldn't say that the right to blame because its rhetoric was too violent. Maybe the right's to blame because its rhetoric and practice weren't violent enough.
The
Or
left was calling
maybe
Trump
the situation is just so
Hitler.
yeah. So maybe we have to think about that because I think it does the what makes it in the democratic piece is an armed piece, and that applies across the world and it applies within countries also. And the at least in and so I would say it's not so much a question of whose rhetoric was louder, whose demonstrations were more violent. It's a question of how do we keep things balanced and not violent, because we don't want violence. We don't want actual warfare. We don't want assassinations. We don't want this kind. We don't want people shooting at presidential candidates. And but we're going to have to put the fear of God in a lot of godless people, and that's a problem. How you do that? That it's clear that there's a big fear of God gap between the left and the right, and the right for the country to survive as a democracy, not just for the right to survive, but for the country to survive as a democracy, the right is going to have to take steps to put the fear of God back into the left, and that's not going to be so pleasant in a lot of ways, unfortunately. But that's the situation that we're in.
As we conclude, coming back around to Israel and the Middle East, where we've got plenty of violence, would Trump or Biden be a better president in terms of American foreign policy in the Middle East? And to put it another way, is there one or another candidate that Israelis should hope wins the presidential election? Maybe to be a little more specific, if I could ask you to look towards the future of Israel's strategic position militarily with Hezbollah in the north, a conflict there that's been going on, and maybe it's not as publicized abroad, but it's very serious. There's a perception that Joe Biden is holding Israel back from doing what it might need to do to engage with Hezbollah. This stuff's complicated. I'm just throwing out there as one sort of notion that's in the air. And I've heard credible people actually say, serious people. I don't want to misquote anybody, but I believe Ahmed Cohen, if you know him at Tikva, said that with Trump in power, Israel would be likely more at liberty to do what it needs to do. In his view, it was to, in effect, if not officially, annex up to the Litani River. which is a natural border. And without a natural border with Lebanon, which is now in effect controlled by Iran through its proxy Hezbollah, we are really in Israel sitting ducks. I don't know, if everybody understands this, but it's a very, very serious threat to our lives.
Okay.
Pushing into the territory of another country is frowned upon nowadays, but with possibilities like this being discussed, and I'm not a military strategist, I'm not asking you to necessarily be one either. Do you have a sense of which president in office might be better in terms of foreign policy and in terms of Israel's ability to defend itself?
Look, the first thing to say is put not your trust in princes. Trump has his own agenda, and people mostly have to solve their own problems, and you can't rely on powerful leaders with their own agenda. But the problem is that the Biden administration seems to support both sides. It's not just that they restrain Israel; it's that in crucial ways they've done things to build up the power of Iran. They've done things to build up Hamas. They've done things to save Hamas. Okay, so my wife said to me when I was writing something attacking this, she said, "Well, do you really want, say, a Kamala Harris administration that's going to come down on the Palestinian side?" And I'm like, I'm not sure that would be. I don't see. That's not so clear to me that would be worse. Frankly, I'm not sure it would be worse.
Worse than what?
Than the Biden administration supporting the Palestinians and the Israelis at the same time.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay.
Oh, Harris.
Yeah. With regard to Lebanon, I don't have any reason to think that Harris would be worse in any relevant way, and she would be better, at least in the way that she, being mentally competent, would make decisions where he hasn't made decisions, or at least she has the potential of making decisions where he doesn't.
And
really
Trump, how would you? So you're comparing it to Biden, which is good, because right now we need to wonder who's going to be running for president. They're going to be running against Donald Trump.
Right. So with Trump, I think he was pretty clear on what he wanted in the Middle East. Circumstances have changed some. I don't think the idea of going up to Litani again, invading up to Litani, look, personally, it seems to be the missiles can be launched from behind the Litani. You'd have to ask how much difference it really makes an Israeli presence up to Litani, how much that what the costs are in terms of people killed below the Litani. We've been in Lebanon before, and Ariel, at the time when Israel was redeploying in Lebanon after the first Lebanon war, it was Ariel Sharon who vociferously in cabinet opposed a continued Israeli presence in Lebanon. He opposed the creation of the security strip. He wanted to pull every single Israeli soldier out of Lebanon, and he was the guy who launched the first Lebanon war in the first place. So I think these things have to be looked at very carefully. You have to say, what are the threats this is going to deal with? What are the likely costs? And even if we were to be green-lighted in Lebanon, right, Israel restrained itself in the second Lebanon war, despite the fact that it had a green light from the powers to do whatever it wanted. And
what are we going to do with our northern territories that 60,000 people or more, something like that, are internal refugees? Right. I hear what you're saying. It sounds very challenging to deal with the situation the way that you describe and the way that's been tried to some extent in the past. But what's the alternative? Are we going to cede a security strip inside of our country?
Right. So we have to have policies that will really meet the threat. And it's not a good or a tenable situation. And whoever's running the country this week and next week has to have a plan, an executable plan to get out of that situation. They will have more degrees of freedom if Trump is president than if the Democrats are in, and they'll have a clear American attitude if it's anybody but Dementia Joe is president. But still, you need a plan that's going to work, that has some prospects that it will work. And seems to me that you have to have some way of threatening to do things to Hezbollah that will really threaten its position in Lebanon. And what those are is not so clear. But if you can, I think that probably Hezbollah's situation is sufficiently tenuous, for example, that if you could get international support for an air and sea blockade of Lebanon in response to these provocations, that would force them to damp down. So that, if I were the architect of Israeli policy, or if I were advising the architects, I would say to them, look, well, we want to get in a situation where we can do an air and sea blockade of Lebanon, which we've done before. That's not costless either. That will get people killed also. But still, that's what we're going to try to do. That's a pressure point on Hezbollah we're not using now. In order to do that, we need an international green light. And so we have to maneuver diplomatically to get that international green light. Doesn't seem to me that Biden himself is capable of giving us that green light. That's too much of a decision for the limited decision powers of Joe Biden. But he's not going to be part of it is to draw up these plans and put them in the drawer to take out for the next president. But we have to work towards that in order to solve that situation. Unless
would the Biden administration or Kamala Harris administration push a so-called two-state solution much more strongly on Israel? Israelis don't want that now.
A two-state solution means the Palestinians have to give up trying to kill Jews. What's their plan for getting the Palestinians there? Right. So it's not you can force an Israeli withdrawal, you can force this, you can force that. But if you're going to talk in terms of solutions, it means the Palestinian National Movement has as its priority a state of Palestine alongside Israel. That's never been their priority. It's not their priority now. And there are ways that you could push them in that direction, but you can't make that one. This is a classic example of free will. You can't make people do something they really don't want to do. And you can incentivize it more. And that was part of Trump's Abraham Accords. But even Trump's Abraham Accords were not sufficient incentive in the time that they were that Trump was in office, and they might not be sufficient incentive if Trump comes back into office. So we have to, So can the Democrats, can Biden, Harris, can Trump, if he turns on us, force us into making concessions to Palestinians? Absolutely. Will those concessions move us towards a two-state solution? Only if there's a change in the priorities of the Palestinian National Movement, and that change is not happening now. It's not currently, doesn't seem to be happening now. And if anything, there's been change in the other direction. So I'm in some ways more centrist than a lot of people, and who regard themselves on the right. And so if the Palestinians are willing to make a deal, then I'm not sure that I'm the person who's willing to say, no, I'm willing to risk my lives and risk my life, the lives of my children to prevent an actual Palestinian state alongside Israel living peacefully. I don't agree with that. But to get there requires a change of heart on the part of the Palestinians that there's no sign that they're in the process of making, and we need to be realistic about that, regardless of what concessions we're forced into making.
So, finally, you've been very generous with your time. What are the lessons, some of the lessons of Israel's year of dangerous living, of this year from last summer to this summer, or some of the lessons of the Gaza war, if you like? And why should anyone else, other than folks like you and me, Israelis, care? I asked a moment ago about the election in the U.S., how it might affect its ally, Israel's chief ally is America. So it's a significant question to Israelis, but Americans have to think about the president that's best for America. And so I wonder,
if you think that Israel is battling for Western civilization and that there's a war with Iran that Israel's involved in, and that in effect, to support Israel in that is to not only support Israel, but it's really to support Western civilization and to do what's best for the West. What are some of the lessons, and why should folks care who are particularly hung up on Israel just for its own sake?
Well, the most important lesson is that you have to be ready where you are to defend yourself. And the settlements that were ready on October 7th were hit less hard than the ones that weren't ready. That's a sad thing to say, but it's true. And that's the most important lesson, I think, is that insofar as Israel's defense problems are local problems, in other words, they're problems that happen here and not there, people locally, right? If this kind of terrorist infiltration is something that you have to be ready for wherever you are right now. And unfortunately, a lot of people were killed because they or others were not ready. And where people were ready, things weren't as bad. That's an important lesson of October 7th itself. And it's a lesson everybody needs to take everywhere they live, because unfortunately, this kind of Islamic militancy terrorism is a threat to everybody everywhere. So, what are you doing where you are? How are you ready where you are? You yourself, to protect yourself, to protect your family, to protect your church. What are you doing? How are you ready? The readier you are, the less likely bad things are to happen to you, and the more likely you are to be able to mitigate them if they do happen. That's the most important lesson. It's not a lesson the Israeli government has applied thoroughly enough, frankly. It's not a lesson. There still is no right to bear arms. Every adult without a criminal record in Israel should be able to get a gun, just like every adult in America without a criminal record get a gun. And it's stupid that that's not the policy, and it's unconscionable. But
and should people care, perhaps, because of that threat of Islamism beyond Islamism could be considered a threat to the world?
So here, here we have, the terms you use force me to a little technical political science, which Israel's not of the West. As Huntington said, it's a Jewish civilization. We're allies of Western civilization from the outside, but we are allies in the current struggle with Islam. Okay, there's an Islamic civilization, there's a Western civilization, there's a Jewish civilization, there's a Hindu civilization, there's a Japanese civilization. Islamic civilization is currently the enemy of a lot of them, a lot of these other civilizations. And so what you see is an intercivilizational alliance, right? People like Modi. Modi is not very Western at all. And the Prime Minister of India, and the more you read his biography, the weirder it looks from a Western point of view. But he's clearly an enemy of Islam. He's therefore clearly an ally of Israel, and therefore clearly an ally of the U.S. insofar as militant Islam is hostile to the U.S. And it's a global war of civilizations, unfortunately. And in that global war, you need allies. Everybody needs allies. The little civilizations need allies, and the big Western civilization needs allies. And so this fight matters to you also. The fight where you live matters, and the fight of your allies matter. And it's important to know what side you're on. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you should, you have to keep in mind, though, that what matters to you is most important, right? So, I noticed, for example, in the Finnish parliament, one response to October 7th was to start asking questions about whether their support for the Palestinians is helping them, is pro-violence or anti-violence. If you're a Finn and you're watching this, or an American and you're watching this, ask yourself if the policies of your government are helping you, or helping your security, among other things, helping your security in this unfortunate global battle against militant Islam. And that's the question you need to be asking. And from that, you will derive some sort of attitude towards what your government should be doing toward helping Israel, and how you should be helping Israel.
One more question. Why is it that there wasn't sympathy for Israel after October 7, when people, had been accustomed to condemning Israel, saw what happened. Why didn't they say, okay, but I mean, this is much too much. We're very critical of Israel, but if they're up against this kind of like ISIS level serial killers, we've been very critical of Israel. Israel's settler colonial and bears the sins of the West that we project onto it. I'm ventriloquizing now and editorializing at the same time. But for Israel's critics, why wasn't the shock of the Hamas attack sufficient to get them to be more nuanced? Israel's popularity has gone down in the world, not up. Is it possible to say why that is?
Yeah, so here I suggest you interview Josh Mitchell of Georgetown. He gave a very interesting presentation at the National Conservatism Conference I just attended on the whole rhetoric of innocent victimhood and how the loss of Christianity has produced in this West the search for the innocent victim, who is celebrated and whose innocence, the innocence of the Palestinian, the innocence of Muslims, right, was somebody's anti-Muslim film, right, is something that that has to be maintained at pretty much all costs, and in the face of all the facts. I think that sort of Mitchell theological analysis, religious analysis, is the most persuasive one I heard, and I would just endorse it and recommend that you bring Mitchell on, Professor Mitchell of Georgetown, on and interview him.
Great idea. I will be happy to get his contact info from you, and I would really be happy if you'd perhaps consider joining us again a year from now, and we'll look back once more and see where we are then, because it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Michael, and it's really been a privilege to hear your thoughts and have your thoughts on these pressing issues of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabby.